I'm honored to be here today. We have 4 great panelists who I think, as you'll see, is an interesting blend of different facets of seed stage investing, both across pharma and medical devices. And maybe what I'll do is ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves. The bios are there, but maybe also just briefly tell us kind of how they fit into the seed stage financing, and then we can dive in from there. Christy?
Good morning. I'm Christy Schaefer. I'm a general partner at ASRS Venture Partners in Durham, North Carolina. We've invested in about 3 ophthalmology companies since I joined the firm about 5 years ago, and I've been managing what's called ASRS Discovery, which is the earliest stage of our seed fund focused on great science out of outstanding university research and translating it as quickly as possible into the clinic.
I'm Mark Blumenkrantz. I've spent the last 35 years as an academic ophthalmologist, vitreoretinal surgeon, and department chair for the last 18. And over the last year and a half, I'm transitioning away from a chair to spending about half my time at Stanford still teaching, and the other half having started up an early stage investment fund, incubation fund that is working primarily in ophthalmology and also in protein engineering called Lagunita Biosciences.
Hi, thanks, Ollie. Angela McFarlane, Managing Member and CEO of Foresight Labs. In partnership with Jean Dewan over the past 11 years, Foresight has founded 6 companies, gotten those funded and taken them forward, 4 to acquisition and 2 to strategic relationships. Foresight is really focused on the early stage idea, and although funding is also very important, our focus has been on really truly very critically assessing what ideas really are worthy of taking forward, especially in times when it's a little bit harder to fund. In addition, we're looking at our business model as it's changing as well, which includes also early stage funding in a potential fund, and then also partnering with entrepreneurs on ideas and taking them forward to funding. So a little bit different than traditional just investor side, but we got 2 incubators here to take your ideas, right, Mark?
It's where all the good ideas come from, right?
Hi, I'm Faraz Rahal, and most people in the eye business know me as a vitreoretinal surgeon in Los Angeles, which I continue to be, but I'm participating in this panel in my capacity as partner at Excite Ventures. Excite is a ophthalmology-focused small VC that makes early-stage investments in companies with innovations in treatment and diagnosis of eye disease. That's including devices, drugs, and technologies. It's a 7-member group made up of ophthalmologists, investment professionals, and attorneys, and it's located through Boston, New York, and Los Angeles.
Great. Well, I think the interesting thing about this panel is, there's a diversity of both pharma, medical devices, but also investing and idea creation. And I thought, the place that would be interesting to start is just to get a lay of the land of what the environment's like. And I think as you guys just heard, there has been a divergence between pharma and medical devices. But maybe the best place to start, Christy, Faraz, I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on seed stage financing from the pharma perspective, and how is that climate? How easy or not is it to find interesting things and to fund them on the pharma ophthalmology side?
Okay, shall I? Biopharma is always an area that might be entered with caution, especially in the early stages. And the obvious reasons that stand out to everyone is the proving of efficacy and safety is challenging, and that everyone in the room knows that. But then there are some other less obvious barriers, particularly for a smaller firm who is making a smaller and early investment. Cost is the first thing I would think of, which can be a barrier. It's a high cost area, and that can be a challenge. There are steep regulatory barriers. Maybe most important for, again, seed stage, smaller level financing in those stages is the long duration of the time commitment. The extended expected time to realistic exit, and that can scare off some early financiers for sure. Despite all that, we still have an appetite for biopharma. We seek it, and we are interested in it, but we look for very specific characteristics. I can't list them all, or I'll eat up the whole time, but two things stand out in particular to me and to our group. The management team. An experienced management team which has a documented record of clinical trials experience or preclinical experience, and of course a massive bonus is a previous history of a proven exit. That really catches our eye, of course. And then secondly and finally, capital efficiency, which would be obvious in any venture, but specifically with drugs, because of the cost, capital efficiency would mean a lot to us, and we look specifically whether the startup company has achieved or is planning to achieve non-dilutive funding like economic development programs or grants.
I'll just add a few comments here. First of all, I would say that the ophthalmology sector is extremely attractive, whether it's biopharma or med tech, and even diagnostics and healthcare IT. We have found it to be a really good set of opportunities because the research can be very focused and you can get answers relatively quickly, both at a preclinical level and at a clinical level. We have had the privilege of investing in 3 different companies. One has gone public, Clearside. We've invested with Farazan Trefoil Therapeutics in San Diego. And that's an example of a company that took advantage of great NIH funding. They received the very selective Trend Award from NCATS this past year, and it actually is funding all of their preclinical work to the IND. And so we came in as investors with a relatively small round that will take them pretty far because of the Trend Award as an example. We also look for great management teams. We look for outstanding science. Validation from NEI or NIH is often there with the companies that we've invested in, such as Graybug Vision out of Hopkins. And at the end of the day, we try to move things as fast as we can to ask the real killer questions and find the answers as quickly as possible.
And by the way, thanks about the trefoil thing.
So, I at NEA do both biopharma and medical device investing, and I do think there is a stark difference. But I'm sort of curious, Angela and Mark, you kind of do a little of both, but how would you compare kind of the seed stage financing, and on the medical device side, and subsequently getting like a Series A done, especially out of an incubator? I mean, I will say, at NEA, we do device incubation, but it's on the device side, when it came time to spin out and raise a Series A, it wasn't uncommon for our companies to go talk to 250 investors hoping to find one and coming up empty. And my sense is it's getting better, but I'm curious, you guys are on the ground. I'd love to get your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think we have spread the opportunities between pharma and device, and I think for a long time we're focused in pharma when I think some of the device elements in terms of development were more challenging, such as FDA, getting into the clinic, the preclinical timing that was required by FDA. I think that has changed thanks a lot to the ecosystem and folks at NEA actually helping really push on, an innovative platform at FDA. So I think that did dissuade us a little bit. I think now going back into the devices that I think it's the quality of the idea, and I don't think we look at anything different or in a biased way, whether it be biotech, pharma, or medical devices. It's really about the quality of the idea and how can you get to that proof of concept clinically, as Christy was mentioning. The barriers are different, the exits are different. I think you do fund them differently and have expectations on outcome that are different. So you just have to change your mindset when you're looking at that. Yeah. But I wouldn't say I would shy away from a PMA versus a 510K. It's really about the quality of the idea.
Makes sense. Mark, what are you seeing out there these days?
I think if you're looking at it from the perspective of funding, then you sort of have to, a lot of times it boils down to money seeking the highest returns, and it is a harder sell to finance devices than it is drugs. On the other hand, the pathways tended to be shorter and the regulatory barriers were a little lower, and the early stage costs are considerably lower, plus you can usually build a prototype and test it even in a human during the incubation phase or during the Series A phase. So in that regard, they're better in terms of the immediacy of understanding whether you've got a science project or whether you've got a company. And I think that's where incubators continue to play a really important role. If I look even at what you've done at Foresight and what we're trying to do, we try to have a balance, kind of a ladder of pathways to commercialization and then eventually exit. And I think devices play a pretty critical role. So I see them as part and parcel of a hedge strategy, and a diversified hedge strategy where you want to have a little of both. But I do think that they have relative advantages and disadvantages. And as long as you know what you're dealing with and you understand that in the context of your overall ecosystem, I think they work very well.
What about, I'm curious, ophthalmology versus other sectors? Any thoughts on whether it's easier to get companies funded, started up, or harder? I know we're kind of a self-selected crowd here, but I'm curious if you guys have any viewpoints on that.
I'll defer to some of the other experts on the other specialties. We have experience with ophthalmology only, and I would say that ophthalmology probably is a little easier to get funding. I think it has a number of advantages for science in general and for investment. The first being that the eye is unique anatomically. It has a sequestration and an almost immune privilege or a privilege that allows for excellent preclinical and certainly clinical testing. And this affects other specialties who are looking to develop a product. We see this with autoimmune diseases. We see it with neurological diseases entering into ophthalmology as a side idea initially. Then they develop a product maybe for ophthalmology, but initially just for the testing. Secondly, I think ophthalmology is advantageous because ophthalmologists, and this is a compliment to the audience and I guess ourselves because I'm an ophthalmologist, are in general, and retina specialists specifically are, I think, quite innovative in their practice and in their models of treating disease. They tend to be early adopters of new technology and new therapies, and not just in theory, but in clinic. The story of anti-VEGF therapy is incredible. 1 minute Phil Rosenfeld was putting Avastin into the eye of the first patient, and 2 years later, it's done thousands and thousands of times around the world off-label. That's incredible, and it's an adoption habit of ophthalmologists, and I think that's an advantage for early-stage companies.
I think if you take the long-term view, maybe even looking at it over a course of 40 years, ophthalmology has kind of been a vanguard medical specialty in terms of new technology adoption, whether you look at lasers in medicine, whether you look at microsurgical instrumentation, whether you look at the use of custom pharmaceuticals, whether you look at the genetic diseases and gene therapy. All of those have been worked out in ophthalmology first. It's not really an accident. It has to do, one of it, it's an accessible organ, as you say. So you remove some of the complexity of systemic administrations and so forth. But also, the outcomes are pretty straightforward. We have a great visual acuity endpoint. We have, we can measure intraocular pressure, things like that. And as a result, you can really understand fundamental technology shifts, real disruptions, using biopharmaceuticals instead of small molecules, using small instruments instead of large instruments, using genetic testing to actually tailor treatment of diseases. All of those have been done before. So I think that smart investors, will continue to look at ophthalmic innovation, not just for the sake of what is the total addressable market, but what does it mean about getting in on the ground floor of a new technology wave and riding that wave to other specialties as well. The canary phenomenon, if you will, in the coal mine.
I can give the perspective of just being in ophthalmology for what seems like 12 short years, or maybe seems like a lifetime, but having come from cardiology and really looking at the innovation in that sector as we were moving devices to less invasive, looking at stents, looking at drug-eluting stents, looking at fundamental systemic therapies in heart disease. And when I got into ophthalmology, really what struck me and what continues to be unique is to your point, I think the customer, the ophthalmologist, and the patients want to seek better therapies. They are very technology driven. They are very committed to their patient outcomes, that this is a relationship over time that a specialist has with the patient, and that they want to strive for those better outcomes. I think that they're also looking at how does it work for their business, how does it work for the sustainability of the therapy, and so I think there is an ecosystem here that I think is unique, and vision is valued. I mean, it strikes fear in the heart of many to think about losing vision, and I think everyone relates to that, and I think that the folks up here doing the early stage, and Mark, your success and a lot of the success in the sector have made it very attractive for investment.
And I think one other point is that the FDA tends to give very clear guidance in terms of what is needed in the ophthalmic indications, and that's extremely important to investors to be very clear about how focused your study can be and how quickly you could get an answer. For example, in glaucoma, where there's intraocular pressure readouts that can be determined relatively quickly. I've seen more and more companies at Hatteras down the ophthalmology area over the last 5 years, and I continue to believe it's a really attractive market. It's growing quickly. There's a clear unmet medical need, and I think more and more investors are coming to the realization it's a very attractive market.
I think we might also, and maybe we'll talk about this in the next segment here, Ollie, is that let's also treat it very carefully, because I think you can overwhelm a space with follow-on innovation that actually is so incremental that you end up kind of killing the buzz, so to speak. and I think there's a responsibility here, not only that the ideas and the companies be excellent in every way, but that there be less a herd mentality, and that we be careful about making those careful investments. And maybe the scarcity of capital or the more difficult fundraising environment will kind of balance that out and keep the sector extremely strong.
Yeah, no, I think I've always said ophthalmology is the best kept secret. I'm not sure why it's a secret, and I agree. As a venture investor, I'd rather keep it that way. But maybe to segue a little bit, given that I have such a esteemed group of people, I've decided to give up the venture capital game. I have a dry AMD compound that I want to start a company around, and I've licensed the IP. And I guess my question to you all is, I need to get it funded. What should I do? And I'd love to hear kind of how you guys think about, getting seed Series A funding and what's the best path, because there are other people here who, I'm sure are thinking of along the same lines, whether they have an interesting technology or drug or device that they want to do that. But Mark, maybe we can start up with you.
So I'll share my views. I don't know if they're insights or there may not be good insights, but both as a technology entrepreneur and then more recently as a funder, I think people look for three things. I think they look for an unmet need. They look for essentially a very, very strong founder or a founding team, maybe two people, one that knows how to communicate and sell and one that knows the technical side, and then they look for good quality science and a rational business plan. And I think if you can do that, you can get funded. When you get into the issue of seed funding in particular, as opposed to subsequent rounds, that's more complicated. And I think what it really takes is a couple of items. One is you really have to have, I think it's hard to get funding unless you have proof of concept. People come out with a mechanism of action, an MOA, or they come out with a new novel compound and they've used it on human endothelial cells, or maybe they've published, maybe they haven't published, they haven't filed a patent, and of course that's an unfundable thing. I think as you start adding layers of validation and verification, filed IP, a good publication paper, maybe a small number of animals that have been treated with statistically significant and clinically significant endpoints. I think those are the kind of things that at least will get you in the door and get you a listening. At the end of the day, you still have to have the other stuff, the communications ability. I think there has to be a sense that the founder either is a great scientist or has a great business mind, even if they're immature, if you will, in terms of not having done this. And I think those are the things that people look for, at least in my experience.
Ali, I think I would tell you with an early stage dry AMD
It's going to be big.
molecule that I think
It's going to cure everyone.
I think that I would dissuade you from seed stage funding because I think I would send you to NEA and say if they like it and they were willing to do a Series A, even though it's tranched, to partner with you to risk reduce, to get some of these things that Mark talked about. That would be the way to go. I mean, I think seed stage funding for something that's going to require so much capital that's really at the early stages, you have to really look at that seed stage funder and say, is this a group that can really follow this technology along, or will they get crushed when I raise my Series A, when I raise my Series B? And I think that is really, when you fund with the wrong kind of money early on, you are then later forced to either wash out your early investors or really not be able to maintain the consortium in a way that's viable. So I think with something like that, you're more likely to want to get the grant funding, to get to that proof of concept, and really look at the idea and say, I have all of the things, I've checked the boxes, but am I truly differentiated here? Or do I just think I have a new mechanism that sounds good or might apply, in order to go to a seed stage funder. An angel, a small group, you have to be able to look at them and say, I think this is something where I can maintain your ownership, Ferris, and not wash you out.
So I guess I can cross Angela
respond?
off the list. Christy or Faraz, you guys want to invest?
Yeah,
or?
I want to answer Angela's comments. I totally agree with everything you said, and I would make a shameless plug that I think we can do it. It takes a certain level of expertise, there's no question about it, to be able to run through and guide and lead and help to develop the program and stay on point and stay on the milestones. And I think that if the seed stage funding comes with a high level of expertise, I think it matters and it can be successful, and there's no doubt that the dilutional effects later can be intimidating for a small group. There's no doubt about it. But we would advise the startup to try to get as much non-dilutive funding as possible. Many people miss that for whatever reason. Maybe they're not aware some are available. And then we can help in many ways: financial, legal, IP. We have real ophthalmologists who have done tons of clinical research and trials themselves, myself and others, and I think it can be done. And I think if I were answering the question directly to the startup, I would direct it maybe to someone like Mark's group, which is a more incubator model. It's fantastic to get that kind of input from experts at an early stage, but I do think the small VC may bridge a little bit of a gap, notwithstanding the truth that you just said, between early kind of angel, friends and family rounds and the later big boy rounds.
What about, often, companies, and I'm sure people in the audience can attest to this, they go to a venture capitalist, they hear, well, you're just too early, right? They come back, you have some data, you hear, well, it's still too early. What does that mean? I mean, help me decipher what that means because everything's early, but at some point, you become later.
People refer, there just is an awkward phase. It's, I don't know if it's adolescence or early childhood in the Erickson model, but it has to do with the fact that this so-called valley of death between a concept and sort of potentially a viable company, which is real. And I think that's where accelerators, the Y Combinators and the accelerators that now exist at University of Stanford has its own accelerator, StartX, it's nearby, and UCSF has QB3. And I think that's, I just think venture can only do a tiny percentage of the deals that you see, I don't know, what is it, less than 1%, right? And so there's 99% of the people out there that are roaming around, they're convinced that they have the next Google or Genentech, and you know, some small percentage of them probably do, and the problem is trying to figure out how to break out from the pack and be recognized. And I think that's where you can use other non-traditional sources of funding. These accelerators are one approach, incubators are another approach. There's slight differences between the two. You can also use things like the Coulter Foundation, which has funds available specifically for taking it from a mouse and figuring out how you would use it on a human. And then there's always the SBIR pathway. People look at it and say, oh, it's only $50,000, and I don't find out for a year and a half, and whoever reads the grant's probably gonna steal the idea and do it anyway. And some of that's true, but it is also true that if you make it through the initial cut of an SBIRR, you have access to hundreds of thousands of dollars of non-diluted capital. And so that's another route. And so I think all of those things, and then there's finally the angel route, where you go to individual angels. I think from the entrepreneur's perspective, there's a second piece to it, which is assuming people want you, who do you want? And that's a whole different set of questions and answers, and I think and I would say in a word, it's mentorship, or two words, mentorship and integrity. Are these people that actually can teach you how to do this, and can you trust them to do the right thing by you as the entrepreneur and also for your patients? And I think there are lots of people like that around, and I think it helps to live in Silicon Valley or Cambridge or La Jolla, you know, or Seattle, but you can do this other places. But I would say that's another aspect to it, is go where the action is, and go where there's the ecosystem and the infrastructure to support it.
Ali, I think what you're looking for here is candor, right? So I can promise if anyone comes to Foresight with an idea that you will get a robust discussion and you will get candor about the viability of your idea in our thinking, right? Not, oh, if you just had another mouse study or you just had something else. It's really fundamentally, you know, is the message you're getting from the venture capitalists, I'm just not that into you, right? You could have, you know.
I mean, what's not to love?
Yeah, what? So I think the idea of an incubator, I think Foresight in particular, we can only choose so many things to do. And I think really being critical, highly critical, and very candid with entrepreneurs and physicians, university groups that have an idea. It's something we haven't done as much of, perhaps, because a lot of our stuff was internally incubated. But I think that that's the commitment we can make. And it's just very important that you don't bark up the wrong tree for too long, because then not only do you not get funded, or you really don't get there, but we need to create that, and we need to foster that in this ecosystem, that we have the candor about the idea to say, look, I think it's me too. I think it's maybe not as differentiated. I think you're great. Maybe your management team should run this other thing. I mean, there's lots of creativity you can do once you get in a candid environment and you're really talking about best and brightest technologies.
So I completely agree with Angela, and I might invest in you, actually, because you're very passionate.
Yes.
And that comes through, and that's part of one of the things that we look at in a management team. But I think it's, we often talk to companies in this very early seed stage for 6 months or a year or even longer, and we help them develop strategies. Many times we may or may not invest, but maybe we help them connect to somebody else who will invest if we like them. What's really important is that they're listening and that we're sharing ideas and thoughts and hopefully building on what they had initially thought about. And so over time, we often then invest in those companies that we feel like we have that strong relationship with. And sometimes it's been as little as $1 million initially, but those companies have gone on to raise $40, $50, $70 million and go do an IPO. So I think it can be done. It's hard to do, and you can't do it with everyone, but I think you can make some good choices along the way.
And I think another thing to think about is, for those of you that are on both sides of the table, is the process of fundraising is enormously valuable. And having nothing to do with actually whether you get the money or not, but how do you get an objective read on your ideas, and how do people, because it's very hard to pick out the weaknesses in your own arguments because you've already fallen in love with them all and you're there because of that. But other people will see in a clear and objective way what are the strengths and weaknesses of your proposal. And I can't tell you how many times, basically for every, I've venture funded a lot of companies over the years, and everyone, it was never right the first time, and it was only after going to the first and the second and the third, and I got to literally knock on almost every door on Sand Hill Road over the course of 20 years doing this, and it was incredible how valuable that experience was. And it's, it's a little denting to your ego when you walk out and they tell you to come back when you have human data.
You're not supposed to have an ego in this one.
But you do it and you realize that each and every time your proposal is better for the next one and better for the next one. And sometimes by the time you get to the 7th or the 8th door, you actually have something that resonates, and that's because different people, and I think people are honest, and I think they share their true opinions, and no one has ever, to the best of my knowledge, stolen an idea and run with it in dealing with the venture community or the private equity community. I think they're fair-minded for the most part, and so I would encourage all of you to continue to be that way if you're on that side, and to trust the process if you're on the entrepreneur side, because I think it's extremely valuable whether you get funded from that group or not.
And so I guess if I can't get funded, is it me or is it the technology, and how can you tell? Or, I mean, I've been at this for a while now, so it's, no one's unfortunately ponying up money. So how do I tell? Is it me or the technology?
Well, I think you can ask for candid feedback, but I'm certain it's not you, Ali. I think, looking at the space, looking at how differentiated you are, I think you have to have a certain amount of self-awareness about if you're getting a lot of no's, but also ask for the candor. Specifically, sometimes there's really, it's refreshing when someone says, it's a vulnerability. I'm struggling with this. Can you give me direct feedback on this? Because it's not always the first place people go. They want to blame the animal study or their funding cycle or whatever it is. But I think if you can ask for that specific feedback, you'll get it, and it'll be very valuable.
This is the "it's not me, it's you" discussion.
I've heard that a lot when I was a teenager.
Unfortunately, we're all familiar with it, sadly. It usually isn't the idea necessarily, in my opinion. If it is the science itself, well, that's a problem, and that's going to be hard to remedy. But there's a lot of other common issues that are remediable and aren't the science. I noted a couple. Projected timing of the milestones and the development is often a problem in the early pitch. The management structure, if there is one already, there may be some issues with the management structure that could be realigned potentially that would make the product more favorable. And then finally, something I'll refer to as a lack of focus, which may sound wrong, not focus of the asset, but focus of the development plan or the pitch itself, even the slide deck, where there can be sort of a shotgun approach. Ophthalmology's hot. We talked about that, and the big three, diabetic macular edema, AMD, and glaucoma, find their way onto the slide deck of a lot of non-ophthalmic companies moving into ophthalmology. And for a more sophisticated reader, it sometimes reads as overly just shooting for marketing rather than an actual development plan. And if the entrepreneur and their team could select maybe the single best application and build a slide deck and a pitch around the single best application, we find that easier to get our hands around and decide and do diligence on.
Yeah, Mark?
I think you can assume that if it's your first time, it's your first company, it's you. Whether there are other problems is kind of immaterial. You could have CRISPR-Cas9, and if it's your first time out, you're probably not going to get funded unless you've won the Nobel Prize or it's been the best project of the year. But having said that, you can I think a lot of sophisticated investors feel that that you really invest in people, not ideas, and that a great serial entrepreneur that's done it 5 times and all of their company or her companies or his companies, well, they'll look at something from them and realize that even if they don't have the technology there, they'll go out and get the technology. And I think that's one thing. And I think assuming that you really do have great technology, and it's your first time, you need to have somebody strong at your side, and that's where going out, and that's where the seed phase can actually help. There are some pretty smart seed investors out there, angels, for instance, that are looking. There's a lot of money chasing returns right now. The markets are at all-time highs, and there's been a lot of exits. And so those people are out there, and they're looking for their next gig. And so you can find them, and you can just look them up in the Wall Street Journal, who's had the recent exit. But I think that in addition to that, I think there are things that people look for, and you can tell that if you don't have animal data, I think you're dead in the water. And in fact, if you don't have human data, oftentimes certainly for venture funding, I think you would have a strong view on this, I'm sure. I think it's really hard these days because I think the private equity is kind of moving downstream and venture is kind of moving upstream, and everybody's kind of sort of ending up in the same place where you just want a great founder and you want great science and you want a great revenue model and scalability, and just how far off are you from those things determines exactly how likely you are to be funded or not. And a great team, sorry.
Maybe as we're wrapping up, I'd love to hear kind of what I should avoid or the one mistake that you see made most often that winds up, coming back to make getting either seed financing or Series A more difficult. And any thoughts you have there?
So I would say it's something really general, which is inflexibility. And so I think as you're forming your idea, there may be multiple indications you're exploring. Be willing to hear what others have to say about which ones might be more tractable, for example. The other places of inflexibility are often around valuation. And there are often comments about, well, I don't want to be diluted at all. Well, that's virtually impossible. So I think demonstrating flexibility is an important part of, particularly for a first-time entrepreneur, to be able to begin a real meaningful dialogue that can ultimately get you there, even if you have to talk to 20 or 30 investors to find that one or two that will take a chance.
So you're saying my dry AMD program's not worth $1 billion today, or?
That
was what I was hoping.
It may be.
I think it's realistic expectations and self-awareness is the greatest impediment to getting deals done. I think if you have to have an understanding of your strengths, you have to have an understanding of your weaknesses as a leader and entrepreneur, and then you have to have a fundamental understanding, a realistic understanding of your technology and what market you're proposing to go into. And everybody, I've never seen a business plan that didn't say disruptive in it. Has anybody here ever seen one? But we know that most things aren't disruptive, and so I think just understanding where you've got a fundamental disruption, where you're asking people to think out of the box, and when you're better, faster, cheaper, just understanding that and being aware of it. Because if you've got a great team and you're better, faster, cheaper, you can probably get that funded. But if you've got a weak team and even if you are truly potentially disruptive, you're going to find it to be hard. So if you have that awareness of where all those pieces stack up, it gives you, I think, a better chance of being successful and getting that funding. At least that's my view.
That was really well put, Mark. I think that the biggest indicator of success that we find in people we hire, in ideas we see in early stage entrepreneurs, is a well-rounded sense of humility. We're all passionate and confident in some respects, but I think if you lack the humility, which is really, speaking to being flexible, speaking to being aware of exactly how valuable or applicable your idea is, without humility. So I guess if you too much hubris, I guess would be the thing that would turn us off. And I think it's clearly tied to success. Humility is tied to success.
I agree with all those things, and that's more on the macro, and I couldn't agree more. On the micro side, I'd like to mention three things that I called common mistakes. One I mentioned earlier, which is sort of the lack of the focus of the development program and the application of the product. Number two would be unrealistic timelines and assumptions, which goes along to some extent with the humility part, I think, personality versus technical here. And that shows sometimes in an initial pitch, and that can be a kind of an early turnoff. And then third and final, very specific, skipping steps. And although the intention of that is great, which is to control costs and improve timelines, sometimes those small skipped studies might be the most key to de-risking the product.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time. I appreciate your candor, and I'll take that feedback. And thank you guys so much for participating. Thank you.